So welcome everyone. Thanks for joining us this morning, this afternoon, not sure what time zone you're in. My name is Alison Bradley, and I'm the project director and asset manager for Eastern Operations for Ontario Power Generation. Michael, do you want to introduce yourself?
Sure. For those that have joined us since this morning, my name is Michael Dubreuil. I am the managing partner of a PTAG. We are a global advisory firm specializing in best practices and contracting strategies.
Excellent. So today we're going to talk about a case study for I2PD, and the project that we're working on currently is Otto Holden turbine generator overhauls. This is located at our Otto Holden hydroelectric generating station. It's located in Mattawa, Ontario, and we have 8 generating units there. It's 242.8 megawatts of generating capacity, and it really is a program because it's 8 units, and it includes a repair and replace of turbine and generator components. So it's mechanical, electrical, and civil disciplines that are included in this. The execution phase is going to take place over 8 years, and we're doing 1 unit overhaul per year. And this year, generator 7 is in execution, and we started that on June 21st. So for I2PD, the key really to starting this up and starting a collaborative contracting model in your organization is really about organizational acceptance. I2PD awareness and education is required with key stakeholders such as senior executive, supply chain, legal, finance, and project management. Those are some of the key stakeholders all of us have in our organizations. And it's really important that you have those early adopters and influence to help manage that resistance to change, because we are really used to being in tried and true traditional contracting models. It's planting seeds and providing lots of information and gaining buy-in. So one tip I would give is don't select a project where you really need to get going and your organization has never heard of I2PD. You'll really be setting yourself up for a lot of resistance in that. So this contract model, as I've kind of said, is really against kind of a traditional contract mindset of limiting liability and transferring risk. It's something we would normally want to do. This model is about sharing of risk and reward. And it's sharing it appropriately between all the parties that are involved. And owners traditionally want to have all those savings and not share with people, but in this model, it really has to be shared equitably so that you can get the right behaviors out of people. Proponent selection as well is not solely based on price, but on organization's culture and their capabilities. So it's two, it's both the technical, but also the culture. The parties must possess collaborative behaviors with a willingness to share risk, have transparency in their pricing, a willingness to share their OPEX, and an ability to swap scope. So basically, they kind of have to have this best for project view instead of a best for me mentality. Organizational governance is another area that can be a hurdle for companies, and this is why senior executive from all the organizations that are going to be involved in this project, they need to be engaged and willing to support this contract model from the inside of their organizations. Since it's not a traditional model, other people inside the company may not be accustomed to it, and they may want to override decisions that the I2PD team have decided on. And this could be due to internal authorizations or their regular governance. The I2PD team members, which are on the core team, we'll talk a little bit more about that later, must have decision-making rights and kind of have that reassurance that they can make decisions for their organizations, but also know the boundaries of their company's governance for this type of work. The final key success point, and probably one of the most important ones, and that's why we have this golden nugget on this slide, is really about having a third-party coach or a facilitator. The first project that you do with this model could be a little bit rocky for all the parties because it's just we're not familiar with playing in the sandbox like this. So having someone there to facilitate the tough conversations, keep momentum going is really required. It's someone who understands I2PD and can ensure those key ingredients are happening and being utilized effectively by all the team members. Michael, did you want to comment on this one? Because I know you were involved in a lot of this as well.
Sure. I'm going to skip over the third-party coach facilitator. That's a little bit self-serving.
Yeah.
The one that I think you hit on is the project managers that belong to the core team, having that ability to make decisions and not, as you say, going back to some of the more traditional silos within the organization. They need to be empowered. Otherwise, the decision-making process slows down to a grinding halt, and we end up with the timing of a traditional contract. And under this project that Alison and I are involved in, they do have the authority within boundaries in their governance, and they can make decisions within minutes to keep the project moving forward. And that's a fundamental freedom that really invigorates the team. And as we said yesterday, this is a fun type of project to be involved in.
Okay, thanks, Michael. And the next one is yours.
So Bruce talked about this in his. So we applied this tool. We've applied it twice now, and as we come out of the end of the first execution in the 8-year program, we'll apply it for the third time. And it's a 45 question questionnaire that was originally applied each of the parties to the project, so OPG and their 4 suppliers, each did it individually and scored themselves. And then if you go to the next slide, we aggregated the results using some software that we have. So this was done online. They takes about 2 to 3 hours to go through the questionnaire and be honest with yourselves. We did this at PTAG as well, and our score ended up right in the same parameters as this aggregated results. And there's many graphs behind this for the different categories. But look at that, we're in the orange. We're just barely collectively coming out of the orange. And yet I will tell you from my experience in going through the maturity model that this team is highly collaborative and integrated. But what it helped us do is focus during the validation phase on the areas we needed to train people in. There were several of the methods and a couple of the principles that we had to focus in and help the collective team understand.
Okay, so where to begin? We selected a project that had a rough scope, but it still needed to be refined. So we do overhauls quite often in our organization, so we have a pretty good idea what it entails, but it's really not until you get into the details that you know what's the difference with this overhaul versus another one. So we were in very early stages of the project prior to what we call our definition phase, and that is where we began. So you can see up in the top corner where we have the arrow right before scope development. So it was a perfect project to really start this process. And what that does, it allows all the parties that opportunity with the GC and our OEMs and our engineering firms and our QA and QC group to actually be involved right at the very beginning and have kind of the best moment to make a difference on this project. So that was what we call procurement phase. So there's also a validation phase, pre-construction phase, detailed engineering, which includes detailed engineering and procurement and some construction. And then we have our construction phase, or what we would call our project execution, and the lessons learned. So we'll talk a little bit more about that as we go through.
Yeah, sorry, just one point on this, Alison.
Yeah.
During the procurement phase, One of the things, the same scope, the same RFP documents went out to 17 vendors or 16 vendors, 4 from each category. And the key here is each party in each of the 4 groupings understanding the assumptions that they came up with to put their bids together, allow them to develop their requested estimates. And the differences in the estimates were extreme in some cases, particularly with the OEMs and the GCs. Low to high pricing, where there were double, and a couple of folks in the middle. And it's not that, and these were existing OPG vendors. These were people that knew OPG hydro and the refurbishments. So what that told us, the lesson we learned there is, and it was just popped right out, is OPG had one set of assumptions. They developed the scope that went out. The vendors, in reading that scope word for word, came up with their own set of assumptions, and their assumptions were different, fundamentally different, and not even close in a couple of cases. And it was surprising. What the lesson there is that we all read the same words, no different than today's presentation, but we all understand them differently based on our biases and assumptions.
This one's yours, Michael.
Sure. So I talked about the procurement phase, and then Alison on the previous slide says you go through a validation, which is I think of it as a planning phase. It's concept and detailed scope. Pre-construction is that detailed engineering, construction, planning, and procurement. And so the concept of coming together is to take those assumptions and go through an exercise where you validate the scope such that everybody is looking at the scope with the same set of assumptions. And in understanding those assumptions, you're digging out waste. And so the allowable cost is the price that's set by, in this case, OPG. It was not fully shared with the parties. But as we put their estimates together and selected our team from the 16, we came up with what we knew to be our budget. And then the exercise was by going through the validation phase to work the budget down. And I won't steal thunder from later slides, but we found some significant savings. And then as we came out of validation, we had what was known as the expected cost that the whole team agreed to, and each company signed off on the validation report and committed 100% of their projects to delivering that estimate and the accompanying schedule. And then we went into pre-construction, the detailed engineering and construction planning. And now you're really digging into it, and you're really working through the exercise. And again, we're squeezing costs for the right reason. And we took a lot of costs out of the project and found through risk management opportunity to, and I won't steal from thunder later on, but significant opportunity that added cost back into the project. So there's this back and forth through the exercise, but the overall estimate, the target cost came down. And then at the end of pre-construction, we established what we call the EMP, or the expected maximum price, that again, everybody signs on for and is expected to deliver against as we're in the construction phase on a unit by unit basis. And again, we think through construction, we'll find additional efficiencies. This is a fundamental concept to understand as you begin to think through the various phases and the exercises, the integration. Bruce talked about some come to Jesus type discussions where folks are almost in tears, defending what was in their original estimates. So we've always done it this way. That's the only way we know how to do it. And it was interesting. The first one up was difficult. By the time we got to the fifth one, the fifth vendor, and we did this with OPG as well. Right? OPG had to go through this exercise. Yeah. everybody just kind of threw their hands up and they understood the game. The game wasn't to defend your costs. The game was to figure out what scope was in your estimate. Did that scope belong better with somebody else? And there's a lot of scope trading because of that. I mean, really cool scope trading. And the exercise was to pull waste, duplication, a ton of duplication out of your costs. That just becomes so evident when you do this exercise and compare traditional contracting to the collaborative contracting. I think I could spend all day
excellent.
on this.
So our project team for Otto Holden was obviously OPG. We had Klein Schmidt as our QA QC group. OEM is Andritz. Our general contractor was Stuart Olson, and our engineering firm is WSP. So you can see we had 4 contracting parties with OPG on this one, on one agreement. So I2PD is collaboration and integration, as we keep commenting on. Some of the tools that were utilized on the Otto Holden overhaul project was the big room, the joint risk assessment, shared risk and reward, cost models, and a multi-party agreement. And there was other things that we utilized as well, but we're going to hone in on these ones. So from the big room perspective, we utilize this throughout the different phases. And this is where we were having our face-to-face meetings. You can see the picture in the corner there of one of our actual meetings. I believe that one was actually in validation phase. So this was our kickoff meeting. We used the big room format. We did the maturity assessment, which we talked about in the previous slides. This validation phase was 3 to 4 days a week for 8 weeks during the validation phase. So very intensive. This is where we came up with the integrated risk plan, the integrated schedule, the integrated estimates, and the verification of scope. So everybody would understand what the scope was. The output from this was a validation study with an agreed to scope that everyone fully understood, a schedule that people completely understood, as well as cost estimate that was all combined as one. I don't know if you want to comment any more on that one, Michael, on the validation phase, because it was pretty intensive.
Yeah, so this group in particular is the civil engineering group, and in that group, in that picture, I see members from the GC, from OPG, civil engineering, the equipment manufacturer, Andritz, and the constructor. So they're all, and this was one of the early validation meetings, and the exercise they're going through here right now is validating their research. And what you can't see in this picture is the electrical guys are off to one side, in the other corner is the mechanical group, and then the project management team that were kind of had their scope, such as setting the multiple parts of the agreement, all working in this big room locked in a hotel, I think in North Bay. Mm-hmm. And as they worked through the scope in this particular group, the civil group, if they needed some information from the engineering team, they were just 10 feet away. And so we reviewed in 2 weeks a stack of scope that's got to be, I had it printed out, it's got to be almost 16 inches tall. They went through it, and not only did they review it, they made changes to it. They traded scope. Some of the mechanical scope was given to the electrical guys because it made sense from a piping point of view for them to take that scope. And it was interesting to watch this exercise. So,
yeah. So then, obviously, in the pre-construction phase, we utilized that big room again. Not necessarily the same spot. I think at this point we were over in Montreal, and they were looking at design and constructability reviews, construction planning. Work planning, our schedule enhancements, procurement plans, and the output on this one was an actual project execution plan with a final cost estimate and a level 5 schedule. in the construction phase, also using big room formats for the kickoff meeting. They are at site now, and they are all located in one room. So they can have, you know, safety meetings, the environmental reviews, and all those other things that are going on. And then we have our closeout phase, which we are obviously not at yet because we're just at the beginning of our execution. And the output on that is all the project closeout documents, schedules, and things like that. Any comments on this slide, Michael?
Yeah, sure. So during validation, there was discussion around the project systems to use. So right away we picked, and you got to imagine that, including OPG, four of the five parties are multi-billion-dollar organizations. The QA/QC is a smaller organization. So everybody has their own sets of tools. So we had to pick a set of tools that work for everybody. And so the core team looked at all the various requirements, and one of the tools we picked early on was SharePoint for document management, document control, and there was some development work around workflow and records retention that met OPG's requirements. P6 was an easy choice by all the parties, but except that it was one instance of P6. Nobody did scheduling in their own instance of P6. It was one scheduler running the P6 that was available to the team. And we picked a estimate and cost piece of software that had a unique feature in that it could give, we developed the WBS for the project, but it could give the cost reports back to each of the parties in a format that they could digest within their own organization. So one of the parties uses Ecosys, another party uses SAP, another party uses Jonas, and so they still have their back office requirements, and we didn't want to duplicate all that, so we picked tools early in validation that would support them getting the transparency to feed their back offices and not add a layer of people double typing stuff. As we went through the pre-construction phase, we picked the remainder of the tool set that we needed to go into construction. And the biggest one, I would say, is that was key to the delivery is the construction management tool set. And that actually came from one of the suppliers. It's a combination of the OEM working with the GC since they had the biggest amount of scope at site. We ended up going with, because there's a heavy emphasis on the equipment supplier, we went with their quality management and inspection tool set.
Okay. So the other tool we used was a joint risk and assessment tool. And I'll let you speak to this one, Michael, because I know you were heavily involved in this.
Yeah. So in 2018, when we did our presentation for I2PD at the Indianapolis annual conference for CII, there was a group over from Norway that did a presentation on what they called uncertainty management, what we would call risk management. And they purposely changed the name from risk management to uncertainty management. And the reason they did that is that most risk management focuses on the threats and just walk by millions upon millions upon millions of dollars of opportunity. So we started out with this I2PD uncertainty management plan, followed and it's not a best practice, but I like to call it best practice. And so I pushed that forward. I think it is a best practice in risk management. And the idea was to first focus on the opportunities. We all know how to manage the threats, but we didn't know how to manage the opportunities or take advantage of the opportunities. And we started that early in validation. And then, you know, the joint risk assessment tool continues to be used as you go through each of the phases, and it's an ongoing monthly exercise now that we're there to manage opportunities to conclusion and to mitigate risks that the project faces. And so probably one of the better decisions that the group made in going down this path. And I won't steal some of our thunder from the later slides on this one. So it's a core fundamental requirement to get this right as part of the integration of the teams.
Okay. So on the other areas was a shared risk and reward, or the joint risk pool. And it's calculated as a function of expenditure savings of our estimated payable costs, contingency allowances, and profits. And each risk pool member has a vested interest in the management of the project to reduce those payable costs, preserve that contingency, and as we talked about, exploiting any of those opportunities that arise. So the core team, this was developed by the core team. So basically the ratios and the percentages and things like that is developed with all the team members at the table. The core team is comprised of one rep from each of the parties. And all of the participating parties are putting 100% of their profits at risk for the benefit of this certainty that we're going for. And whatever the work they do is invoiced and it's transparent to all of the parties. In the case of Otto Holden, the core team takes turns reviewing invoices at the end of each month. So they're looking at each other's books, basically. And each party also receives profit and overhead based on their organization's rates. They will make money if they exceed the milestones or objectives that are set out in the validation phase, and even have the potential of sharing in that untouched risk pool funds, and the risk pool being contingency and those savings, those opportunity savings. So you can see here where the distribution is very equitable in this scenario. We have the distribution to the owner of 20%, distribution to the other parties of 80%, and then it gets broken out a little further where, okay, there's a small part which is equally shared among, and then there's another part which is about the scope. And who's kind of maybe got a little bit more risk that's associated with scope. So Michael, do you want to comment any? Oh, sorry, I just have a couple more items. So the splitting of funds, as I said, was developed by the team, not set by the owner. It took about 3 to 4 days to develop this. So, and do you want to comment at all about how this all went down, Michael, as the facilitator for this group?
Yeah, so we had the core group members and a couple of the executive team members participate in this exercise. And at the beginning, I had no idea where we were going to start out. I mean, I wrote something up on the board that said equitable distribution. So this looks simple now when you look at it, but it was intense. But it was intense for all the right reasons. By this time, we're at near the end of the validation phase, and the team is gelled as a single team. And so everybody's contributing to this. If you look on the left-hand side there of this graph, the 30%, the modified equal share, that concept was to say, regardless of your scope, because the scopes vary significantly in terms of dollar amount, you should participate on a flat basis because everybody's equally contributing. Mm-hmm. But you'll notice at the very bottom, so there's the owner, they gets their 20% off the top, OPG. Each of the parties gets 1/5 of that 30%. And then there's a discretionary amount that's left up to the core team to decide where that goes. And some of the parameters around that, it could go to one of the parties because maybe the OEM came up with a really great idea. Yeah. It could go to members of the teams, although this is a union labor pool, so there were big danger, Will Robinson flags that were put up and said, we need a lot of talking before we get there. But not impossible. And maybe it's not money in people's pockets outside the collective agreement. Maybe it's paid for events that fit across the whole team, both the craft and the non-craft. So that's yet to be figured out, and that was kind of put off until we got into execution. And so we've got a year to figure that out. Probably the most surprising piece of all of this is, and the other thing behind this is we modeled it. We came up with 5, Bruce showed you 3 scenarios. We came up with 5 scenarios, very detailed scenarios. We modeled this to see what the impact was, the expected case, the worst case scenario on the upside, the best case scenario on the downside, and then 2 likely cases possible on either side. And I can tell you, when it went back to those organizations, we got a ton of questions on how this all worked. And then we thought we were done. And then this came to the lawyers. This piece here was probably the most exhaustive piece to get through the legal team. And there was 5 lawyers and 5 commercial representatives in the room, and supply chain representatives. And this was probably the most creative piece for the lawyers to think through. And to be fair to the legal and commercial teams, they tightened up the agreement. They found holes in the thinking that got tightened up. So, and again, I think this cemented the collaboration and integration that we see in the team, this exercise.
For sure it did. What doesn't break you makes you stronger. So the last piece we did want to talk about was on the multi-party agreement. So again, it's 4 contractors in on 1 contract, so only 1 contract awarded. The one thing I can say about this is just in general, at the very front end, on when we first were in the procurement phase of bringing people in, it fast-tracked that phase because you only need a high-level scope document along with the draft I2PD table of contents. I call it our terms and conditions. You can see it laid out here of 22 sections. We started this in April of 2018 from a blank, and when I say blank, I mean blank sheet of paper, where we were looking at templates to use for multi-party agreements. Our lawyer was really pulling it all together to proponents in a service agreement by September of 2018. So from April to September, we were able to pull this together. This would, with very broad scope. So this would normally take 12 to 14 months for us. So coming out of validation phase, the parties signed this multi-party agreement. I don't know if you want to comment any further on this one, Michael.
Sure. So, you know, the spirit of collaboration and integration is infectious. So I don't mean to insult any of the lawyers on the phone, but you know, they're trained in this win-lose. And I shouldn't say that. I mean, I've worked with some great lawyers that understand the win-win concept of doing business deals, but there's this natural instinct to make sure the wording is, you know, in your favor to the greatest extent possible. Well, the lawyers sat through various parts of this validation, and they got infected by this collaboration bug. And to watch 5 lawyers not argue against various clauses, but suggest changes and explain different elements of the law. I mean, and this was exceedingly technical down to word phrases amongst the lawyers as they put this agreement together. It was just amazing. I mean, in a group of 5 lawyers and 5 commercial people and some supply chain people, you know, we crafted this in an amazingly short time with vigorous conversation, but not conversation for animosity, conversation for understanding what the clauses actually meant, so everybody was in complete agreement. And as I said, the risk-reward part was probably the most difficult part.
Yeah. So all of these I2PD activities, they translated into the following. Our RFP submission required each proponent to provide the traditional fixed prices, and during the validation phase, the core team was able to reduce the overall estimated price by 32%. The execution baseline schedule was also reduced from 14 to 9 months. 4 vendors basically putting 100% of their profits at risk for equitable decision-making authority of execution savings and you know, being held by them and not the owner. And this is really key to drive the right behaviors. We extended also through savings, we extended our outage frequency from 20 years to 25 years. And this was with an opportunity that we found with our eccentric head cover. And I do have another slide after this, which shows you that piece of equipment. So OPG is also gaining significant savings through all of this, but also the parties are getting that cost and schedule certainty too. Really, it's aligning everybody's interests, having common understanding, collaborating with each other, sharing those risks and rewards, and it's all about what's best for project, which inevitably turns out being what's best for the companies that are involved. Did you want to comment on this slide, Michael?
No, I think your next slide.
Okay. So our next slide is basically in summary. Like I said, our procurement schedule is expedited by 7 months. We have early certainty in that cost and schedule right at the concept phase, and we kind of knew, we were going to really be able to bring those things down. The collaboration on the scope and the design development, and I think the key here is, and we've kind of hit on it a few times, is common understanding, because I think that's when you get into other contracts, that understanding turns into change orders and things like that, not to the benefit of all parties. We had the value engineering, as I talked about in the previous slide, with a 5-year life extension between our major overhauls, which is a great savings for OPG. And you can see that head cover there in the bottom corner is what we were, gave us that 5-year life extension. I won't get into too much detail on exactly what that is, but we do have some issues at that station with some concrete movement, which causes some issues with alignment. And what this allows us to do is maneuver around with this head cover when we're trying to do alignment in the future. As I said, the 32% cost reduction from our RFP prices going into execution, while even adding some additional scope that we didn't have there originally. We have 36% execution schedule reduction from when we received our initial RFPs, and we have further opportunities to improve that schedule during construction. In fact, we're having conversations around that this week in just looking at some scope and trying to further reduce our outage time. We have improved QA and QC plans and oversight. Everybody's pooling together on that and where we want our test and inspection points to be. And we have a party that's involved that's really overseeing all of that for us. And then just kind of a bottom line on this is these are multiple companies really modeling as if they are one organization. And when I say that, I mean truly modeling as a unit, which is not seen quite often. And the team dynamics, when they have those common understanding and common goals, really we see it in the team, and we see it in accountability. We see in the fact that we have meetings that have some rigor to it, and I always use the word cadence. They're regularly scheduled. They are accountable to be there at those meetings. It's important that their views are heard, their deliverables are noted. If they're falling behind, who can help, or how are they going to get back on track? It's almost an expectation that people are at, well, it is, it's not even almost, it is an expectation that people show up, and there's a pressure for people to be present. The one thing I will say about this team is that what we see is constructive challenging one another. It's respectful, but it's all about, do we really want to spend that money? Is that the right scope? Does it do the right thing for the project? And everybody's looking at it in a unified way. Really super supportive behaviors is what we see with the collaboration tools, but also with having this multi-party agreement, the integration element, and creativity, because you have so many views on it from a constructability and engineering and owner. We really come up probably with better solutions because we're looking at it from all different lenses. Michael, did you want to comment any further on this one?
Yeah, so I'm just going to keep driving home on this opportunity theme.
Mm-hmm.
So that eccentric head cover was one of several ideas that came out of the validation phase, but in 2 months, the engineering teams and the core team, the project managers, didn't have time to explore it. And so the price for validation was locked in, but the team wouldn't let it go. And there's a couple of other examples where they wouldn't let it go. So they chose to spend some of their shared contingency to develop the proposal, spend some engineering time and develop the business case to be able to show OPG that a change of scope would have a significant benefit in terms of extending the life. OPG could have said no. The operations folks could have said no, and they would have had to eat roughly $250,000 worth of engineering time to come up with the business case and the engineering. They got the green light, and what you see there is what I like to call the flying saucer. But it wasn't just big opportunities, it was little opportunities. And one last example for an opportunity at the other end of the spectrum was, you can imagine that these are big units. So the picture that Alison showed you, those are massive. If you're inside that generation hall and you're looking down, you see 8 units, and I think the ceilings are like 40 feet high, maybe 50 feet high. These units go deep down into the ground, and that I should know this number, but I don't know. It's like 40 feet deep, where you're down from the top to the bottom into the runner. And so part of the exercise is civil scope, and they have to, because Alison talked about the concrete, they have to dig out this concrete. It lets parts of the mechanical embedded parts rebound and get circular again, because this thing spins in a circle. And then they have to, and to do that, they have to cut all the rebar. And the idea is, after it rebounds, you re-weld all the rebar. Well, the engineering firm came up with a concept in discussion with the construction firm that welding down in this pit, this big tall tube, is not the nicest thing to have to do. What they came up with was this connector technology, this sleeve technology that goes on either end of the rebar that they've had to cut to reconnect it. And that saves significant man hours and improve the health and safety conditions down in that pit for the craft. And that was at the other extreme. And so there's 2 big examples, and there's been multiple examples of opportunities that came up that either, probably the other big one is, under the traditional methods, when they bid, the OEM has its own construction craft and would normally hire a constructor to manage their craft. And the GC that's doing a lot of the civil work has its construction crew and management staff and safety staff and all the stuff that comes when you have craft on site. Early on, and this is probably one of the biggest cost savings, they realized they only needed one GC. And so the OEM stepped back, transferred their construction scope for their work over to the civil general contractor, who had experience in electrical and mechanical, and did that willingly. And it was unexpected. The 2 PMs went to dinner one night and came back and said, "What do you guys think about this?" And so just amazing to watch this when it really works.
Thanks, Michael. And that concludes our presentation. And I can't see the questions right now. I'm going to just close this off, and then we'll take questions.
Yeah, the questions should appear here in a second. Stephen will put them up.
I still can't see them, so I'll leave it with you, Michael.
Yeah.
You can.
Come up, Alison.
They haven't appeared yet. I did have, out of the Holden case study, what criteria did you use to select the vendors for the project?
Okay, so I was in procurement actually at the time that this started. So I was the senior manager for procurement. So I got to see it kind of in the infancy stages, and now I'm seeing it as I've moved over. So for the vendors, it's quite different criteria than what we would normally use in a a more traditional contract model. So we did an invitational expression of interest to OPG long-term vendor partners. So we didn't go to the totally out to the street and unknowns. We wanted to make sure that we had vendor partners that we knew could do this type of work and did it well for OPG. So it was invitational. Michael, you had commented how many there were. What was that again?
So at the invitational, at the expression of interest rates, there were 17 vendors.
Okay. So we had 17 vendors, and the key areas that we focused on were collaboration and integration, project controls, so cost and schedule was key on this, the project team that they were going to utilize for it, and they also did a presentation just kind of summarizing what they understood of I2PD, how they'd used certain collaboration tools in the past. I'm just looking here. I actually have the scorecard in front of me here. So some of the questions we asked, or while we were evaluating them, was do they use continuous communications and issue resolution processes? Do they have experience with different collaborative methods and kind of examples of when they've used it? What else did we have? Does the company have experience in implementing early involvement of key participants? Do they have policies in place to allow for shared cost and reward structures? Financial transparency, how willing are they to share? Because we do need to be transparent in this. Can you think of some other key ones, Michael?
One of the more interesting ones was organizational and executive commitment.
Yes.
Right? Yeah. So one of the vendors, their head office is over in Austria. They had one of their board members fly over and participate. And same with several of the North American companies had a couple of presidents, CEOs, a couple of board members. And they were there, as I think Bruce said earlier, not as figureheads, but participated, not dominating. The key was to let their teams present, because we wanted to get to know their who was going to be working on this. So that was fundamental. But we also wanted to know that decision-making authority, that they had commitment from their executive and governance boards.
Good. So how do you ensure that the joint risk pool is not soft, doesn't have a soft goal, who ultimately decides on its final value?
Well, the team finally decides on its final value. I mean, at the end of the day, the owner can come in and say absolutely not, but that's not I2PD, right? It's the core team to really scrutinize that and say that that final value makes sense. Obviously, if it was really outrageous, the owner is going to come in and say, well, we just can't afford this. But I think people kind of know their boundaries on it, and it's definitely not a soft goal in any way. People are watching that, the puts and takes in that joint risk pool at all times, and they are challenging one another as we move through and who's pulling out and who's putting back in, right? So I don't know if you want to comment a bit more on that, Michael?
Sure. So first of all, to ensure that it wasn't a soft goal, it was a competitive process. And pricing, while not heavily weighted, was still 15% of the scoring requirement. So they had to be competitive. I can tell you in the end that not all the vendors were, not all four were selected on lowest price. I think one out of the four that got picked. The big ones was collaboration and the team. So one is a competitive bid, but that was like your ante to get to the poker table, right? They had to lay those bids out line for line in front of their colleagues. And we had people almost in tears as they were trying to defend their estimate and just watching dollars strip away and people and roles and responsibilities that they thought were going to be on this project that they didn't need because their colleagues in the other company were a better fit for that world. Just think safety. I mean, we stripped out 2 safety folks. Quality, OEM is big on quality, but we had a quality partner at the table. So it was brutal, but brutal in a fun way. At the end of the estimate exercise, everybody came together, everybody got it. You know, the first one was the hardest, and it was hardest on the first organization because they didn't know as they were giving up all of that estimate value that their colleagues were going to have to do the same thing. But they caught on pretty quickly. So definitely not a soft goal, and the result is a 32% reduction in price from procurement through validation, and a further reduction in price through pre-construction, and we're expecting an additional reduction in price as we come through construction.
So this next question really follows on that. How was early multi-vendor pricing reconciled? Was a repricing allowed after scope reconciliation? And it sounds like it was.
Not only allowed, it was mandatory.
Right.
They were given back based on this estimate. It was an integrated estimate. Remember, we picked this collaborative estimating and cost management software that allowed multiple views. So you had a view of each of the proponents, you had a view of each of the scopes by discipline, you had the view of each of the scopes by work package, work breakdown. So that integrated estimate was given back to them. They had to accept it. And on the acceptance of that, that's what the purchase order was issued on.
I could see we're talking again, federal agencies in the United States and your experience at OPG. I think there would be some people here of interest and interested in learning more.
Yeah, well, as long as the price is going in the right direction, it's pretty easy, right?
Right. Did you give yourself an escape clause if bids are refined after project definition and are now outside of allowable cost?
Yes. Clear, simple, understood. At each step, each phase, there's not only out clauses for the project as a whole, which means OPG would go back to traditional pricing, but out clauses for individuals or organizations. If one organization wasn't behaving, the party in the multi-party agreement, they can come together and say, we're going to vote you off the island. It's one of the clear clauses.
And the off-ramps.
And then that's
Yeah.
true too. Maybe Alison, you can talk to that.
Yeah, just we do have an estimated maximum price, which is for 4 units, and we have 8 units. But we do have that clause where, because when we go to the next unit, we write a new business case. That's kind of the OPG process. We go for funding. So it's not a guarantee that we're going to move to the next unit. Probably will, given the condition of the units that we're working in, but it also has to make sense. So if prices start to escalate and schedules start to extend, then no, OPG is not going to continue down that path. So yes, it is on a 1 unit at a time process. So.
I'm going to jump to another question that's related though. This is a long-term project, 8 years. You think you've gotten a trade partner? Oops. Okay, you moved up.
So if we
have gotten buy-in on one-time project without the promise of future work.
Well, I think you have to evaluate each project that you're going into on its merits, and Michael will probably jump in on this one, but the CII research team is looking at, what projects are right for I2PD. Not every project is right for this I2PD, but when we can see things that are of a continuous nature, multiple parties in multiple mechanical, electrical, and civil, a little bit of complexity to it, it does make sense to be I2PD. But you could go with a one-time project with the I2PD model for sure. It's scalable. So do you want to comment a bit more on it, Michael?
I think you're absolutely right. Certainly, the carrot of additional projects is powerful and helps influence and shape behavior, and willingness to agree to terms that maybe you wouldn't want to agree to. You can't ignore that. But right now, particularly in the supplier community, and this summit based on the interest in it is an example, everybody's interested. And bids are starting to come out now and said, we'd like you to participate based on your skill as a GC or an OEM or an engineering firm in our asset new build or refurbishment. Oh, by the way, one of the conditions to participate is you've got 1 or 2 or 3 collaborative contracting examples you can point to.
Right.
Well, it's hard to get the first one, right? So what we're seeing in the community is vendors want to be able to put this on their resumes. So even with today, and it may change 5 years from now when everybody's got it on their resumes, and market conditions change, but vendors right now, particularly forward-thinking vendors, are looking to get experience that they can claim for other bid opportunities.
As a question directly to Alison, did you involve OEMs, supplier, general contractors in the scope development, or did their involvement start during the procurement phase, RFX?
Yeah, so in I2PD, when we start into the procurement phase, our scope is very rough. It isn't well defined. That's the key with I2PD. You can start it earlier than what you would normally do in a traditional model. So yes, so the answer, so it's a couple little answers there. Yes, we involved the OEMs and the suppliers and the general contractors in the scope development. We had a rough framework of what we knew we needed to do, and then they jumped in and worked with us once they were on board in the team. So that expression of interest got the right players at the table, and then that's when we started to get into scope development, and then they could get into better pricing, more honed in on the price and the schedule. So I don't know if you want to comment on that, Michael, but
No, I think
basically it's a yes
it.
and a yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
We started out with a defined scope. We reviewed the scope and removed issues built into the scope language that had to do with traditional contracting. We cleaned that out and brought it down to pure scope, but it was not finished scope by any means.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, we have time for a couple more perhaps. At what point in the design development you typically onboard trade partners to the team? Is the design type sufficient for them to provide an estimate?
So they are involved at the very beginning. So we use a general contractor to bring in the trades partners for us. And so, yes, they were on board at the very beginning with the OEM. That's the key about this, is that they're in the very, very front end of this with you while you're doing scope development. So they have an opportunity there to bring in that constructability and the trades view.
Yeah, and the value engineering process happens when you have them at the table early, and that's where these big and little opportunities start to develop.
Okay. How is profit savings sharing divided among all the parties in your case study of the project?
So it was equitably.
Yeah.
Wow.
Somebody's looking for a percentage.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It was, as we described, it was with effort, significant effort.
Mm-hmm.
It was 8 or 9 people over the course of 3 days, and then probably collectively another 3 to 4 days to get it through the great questions and insights from the legal and commercial teams and to get it right. So it was a significant investment.
Okay. Then lastly here, you didn't specifically say which estimate and cost tool was chosen for the project. Can you tell us that tool? Same with the O&M. I'm sorry, the contract management tool.
Do you mind, Alison?
Yeah, go ahead, Michael. Yeah.
We used a tool called Cleopatra for the estimate and cost software. It comes out of Holland from a group called Cost Engineers. And it was picked because of its ability to do multiple work breakdown structures to fit the needs of the project and to fit the needs of the various parties and giving back the various cost reports that they need. And the quality management and construction management tool we picked was something that's called LMS. It comes out, again, it comes out of Europe, and it was brought forward by the OEM. And so the group sat through 3 or 4 presentations, and we picked it originally for inspections and quality management, because a big part of the quality management was the refurbishment of various components. But it's now being used for daily reporting, weekly reporting, non-conformances, procurement, material receipts and deliveries and issuance. So it's being used for the bulk of what I'll call the day-to-day construction management on site and data collection that's needed to manage on a daily basis.
And,
So
and
LMS
those
in Europe.
and those tools that are selected by all parties having that conversation about which one do they think is the best tool. So it's not, you know, just one organization, not OPG saying you must be in this format. It's the team deciding on the best tool.
Well, on that, we're going to take our lunch break. We're going to be jumping across the pond for our speakers for this afternoon. John Fartheby from the European Construction Institute and Tony Mapleston, the Engineering Construction Industry Training Board, will be coming back to talk with us about the collaboration toolkit. So thank you all very much. Enjoy your lunch, and we appreciate all the questions that have come in.
Take care.
Take care, everybody.
At lunch.